Hi, I'm Regan Robinson, your host of Future Fit, the only podcast unraveling the secrets of how the world's most innovative leaders stay future ready in a fast-paced world. I've spent over 20 years as a futurist and strategist, transforming top global brands and putting investment-backed startups on paths to sustainable growth. Along the way, I've become obsessed with new ways to prepare for the future, because thinking about the long term once a year simply isn't enough. In each episode, I talk with movers, shakers, and path breakers who share their stories about how they turn uncertainty into their strategic advantage. Throughout our journey, we'll discover unconventional and imaginative ways to help you thrive today while leading your teams into tomorrow. Future Fit leaders know that being prepared for what's next is more than a business decision. It's a way of being. Let's venture together as we co-create a new future readiness playbook. The future can't wait, and neither can I. So, are you ready to get future fit? Today, I am thrilled to welcome Jon Judah, an innovative leader helping the world's biggest brands define how their products and experiences can drive growth in a digital economy. Jon is renowned for building great teams and leaders that are obsessed with the intersection of human behavior, emerging technology, and commercial value, and is the SVP of Americas for DEPT, a global tech and marketing agency. Jon has also worked with public sector and mission-based organizations on digital product strategy and design challenges, and he teaches a master's course on digital strategy at Georgetown University. Jon is pushing the boundaries way beyond the boring, and so I am incredibly excited to hear what he's going to enlighten us with today. Welcome to Future Fit, Jon.
Thank you, Regan. Happy to be here.
Likewise, excited to have you. So let's get this party started.
All right.
With the question that I pose to all my guests, which is, what does future ready mean to you?
What does future ready mean? Well, I think, and this is a term you may hear from other strategists like yourself, it's common in the strategy world, is knowing what to do, or at least having an idea of where to go when others don't. And I think it's an important distinction, because you hear future proof. I hate that term because
you'll never hear it on my show.
So I love that you're asking future ready, because I think strategy and the job of good leadership is to prepare for certain outcomes and choices. And so being future ready is all about having a sense of where you're going to be able to go and what choices you might face when all of the options aren't, or all the data may not be that clear. So organizations that can do that, I think, are more resilient and that have a culture of that generally fare better. That's not a scientific assessment, but my own lived experience.
Yeah. Well, that really resonates with me. And I am very didactic about not using future proof and using future ready, because for me, future readiness is a way of being, right? It is a mindset, it's a capacity, it's a capability that needs to be continuously cultivated. It is not a one and done or annual activity that you check off your list. Like strategy is not a one and done and annual activity that you check off your list.
No. Well, and even something I tell my students, if you told me 12 years-ish or so ago that I would have a button on my phone that I would push and a stranger would come to my home and pick me up, and I would ride with them in a car to a destination and get out, I would have thought you were crazy. But there we have a scenario, where we had to, at the time you're looking at transportation challenges, et cetera, and Uber happened to figure that out. So yeah, I completely agree with you there. It's a mindset and an attitude that helps yield the Ubers of the world.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, it's like there's something about exploring the possibilities. You have to spend time in the future in order to actually envision it. And I'm like, you've got to spend time in the future. It's strange. People look at me like I have 10 heads, and I'm like, no, like actually really you have to mentally go there, right?
Well, yeah. And, I think there's also a challenge, which I know you're keen to, and your guests have mentioned as well. There is a stereotype about strategy in the future where you spend too much time there. I think you see organizations, teams, and clients, they start to push back because it's a world that's harder to get your head around. It's harder to envision. That's why you often see, in politics, when they start talking 5, 6, 7 years out, people are just trying to figure out what's going to be at the grocery store on Friday, much less that far in the future. But I agree with you. You've got to push yourself to that place because good strategy is about helping see around the corner. And if you're not looking around the corner before everyone else, then you're going to have some problems.
Yeah, when I always joke, I'm in the business of time travel, actually, because I'm a futurist who actually is a historical nonfiction nerd. And so I actually look to historical insights. I'm also very rooted in the present, right? And I also spend time in the future. And so
That's great, though. Yeah,
yeah,
that's the
my
world needs
social
more of that.
yes, exactly, exactly. So now, as Virgil observed many moons ago, actually, it's hilarious that you actually said that on a recent podcast because I always say many moons ago, blah, blah, blah. But as he observed many moons ago, fortune favors the bold.
Mhm.
And boldness is an essential ingredient of the future readiness recipe because to be future fit, you have to challenge assumptions and you have to embrace risk proactively. And being bold means committing to a future vision that might not be fully understood or embraced by
Right.
your team, by your investors, or even the broader market. And you've written that, I'm paraphrasing here, but in a marketplace where attention is the ultimate currency, being bold isn't just a creative choice, it's a strategic imperative. And so I'm curious, how do you approach boldness as a strategic imperative in your work? And what are maybe some of the biggest obstacles leaders face when making bold strategies a reality?
Great question, Regan. I think the idea of being bold, well, particularly in the creative space, creative agencies, and in our industry, it's a bit of a trope, right? Everybody wants the big idea, and the most creative, ambitious, strategic teams want to do that type of work. I think, I think it starts with working backwards. Like any good strategist, we'd start with the hypothesis to be bold generally requires a level of confidence. And with my teams, I've tried over the years to find ways for those strategists and teams. It doesn't even have to always be strategy people. How are we helping instill confidence in an audience, a client, or what have you, so that they feel they're more likely to be bold? And I think that's gotten a lot harder in recent years because of the economic environment that many brands and organizations face, where the price of being wrong is significantly high. And that's what I speak about a little bit in that about being boring and being same is you're faced with a choice of safety and risk aversion, which probably will work out in a mediocre way, or being a little bit bolder and pushing things. So the how to that, I think, Regan, has really been taking, well, you just sort of mentioned it yourself, is really taking an interest in what's next for that organization. Where are places that they, may not have thought of? You see a lot of strategists talk about insights and reframing things. And several of my colleagues over the years that I've learned from, it's a lot of finding areas that might be some tension. Maybe, an old test I like to always put on strategy work is taking the inverse of it. And if it sounds like nonsense, then it's probably not that bold.
Yeah.
Little tips like that, oftentimes with my teams, I'll give that kind of feedback to find a bit of that and to find, is this something that makes you feel awkward? And I think those are some of the smaller tests. But I think with an organization, to get them to be bold, you've got to go past the provocation. And I think oftentimes strategists stop there. Hey, I'm going to throw a thing out. It'll have a couple insights to get to it, but then it falls down after that. And one of the big watch outs I'll see with my teams is let's make sure we pull it through. And that you and I were talking earlier about, near and far. Well, I think anything that's put to be bold needs some sort of near-term tactical step. So that audience, that client, that team has some practicality they can move from. So it's not just a thing that's thrown out there, a provocation, which unfortunately I think I still see in some other folks' work. Yeah. It'll be a big idea, but it's not anchored in something, anchored in their culture, anchored in a financial reality. So if you can hit the bit of both, though, make them feel awkward and then also have something, one or two next moves, generally you get a chance to see you're on the right path.
Yeah, that really resonates with me because it's like, it's one thing to have a provocation, but then what are the implications, right? What could be, what if, right? You have to, as you said, I like that language, pulling it through. You have to take it a few steps further, whether that's what could be the potential implications to our bottom line or, our
right.
P&L, or what could be the potential implications to, our brand identity in the marketplace, or, whatever that is. You have to, again, you have to go there and live there
Yeah,
for
yeah,
a bit.
you're absolutely right, Regan. And I think, practically, how do you do that? Well, how do we get that audience on board? There's a lot of great tools out there of, I've worked with some colleagues who are great users of analog. They'll have a beacon example.
Mm.
That,
Mm-hmm.
but which one you use is a function of a person's ability to get into the head of their client or audience and know what might resonate with them. Some folks are more inclined to be bold when you can give them the confidence that two or three other similar brands did this, but did it poorly. Others, to your point, might need a business case. They might need to be like, I can't take this forward
Yeah.
unless you can tell me a return.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's why I was saying earlier, it's harder now because you've got to have a few tools in your tool chest and you can't just throw big ideas out and hope somebody takes it.
Yeah, because not everybody is as risk loving, perhaps, as
Right.
you and
Yeah.
I are, right?
Yeah. Most hospitals aren't going to be like, that sounds great. We'll close down the East Wing and take a chance. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things I think are really important about what you said, and it's this mindset component, because the leaders who succeed in making bold strategies and a reality are the ones who understand that boldness is a mindset, not just a moment,
Yes.
right? And I
Yes.
think the other thing is like, because bold, like, because the definition of it, like, people forget that like boldness doesn't always scream. Like sometimes
Yeah.
it can whisper,
Yeah.
right? It's not always
Absolutely.
about the big flashy moves. It could be about the smaller calculated risks that, when compounded, right, can lead to revolutionary or innovative outcomes or changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. And I think you see that, particularly in mission oriented spaces in the public sector and nonprofits where, you know, just getting some behavior change for one sector of their audiences or customer is bold. And, I 100% agree with you. It doesn't always have to be. I think we've just lived, you mentioned earlier the attention economy, and everything has to have a sound bite or you go
Yeah.
viral. And, I don't know that that's the case. I think it's about the outcome and the ultimate behavior change that happens. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's more muted, but just as impactful. I agree 100%.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that jumped out at me is that you just said is like context is important.
Yes.
One of my, I have lots of old lady words. So one of my bugaboos is, is that, people want checklists. They want one and done things. And it's
Uh,
like, no. Like, I hate to tell you, but life and business is very complex and interwoven. And if you're looking for that kind of stuff and you want to build a sustainable, business that is growing, then, that's not going to solve it. And so to your point about the example that you provided, it's like, well, again, what is bold for one company and industry? Like, put it in the context of where you're sitting in that moment, right?
yeah.
Because then that actually might make it a little easier, right,
Yes.
to take some micro steps and
Yes.
make
I mean, a
micro
hundred percent.
decisions.
I completely agree, Regan. And you can look at AI right now. I mean, everyone is head spins. Your LinkedIn feeds are dominated by it. And what you're seeing is, an explosion of piloting. Everyone's experimenting. For some organizations, that ability to just do a small AI pilot around a call center or something is a massive leap for them because they may
Right.
have just finished implementing digital tools and services. And so now they've got another new thing to worry about. Whereas more advanced digitally native companies, they got to really transform the front of the house, if you will. So it is context really matters. And I think, again, that we have to fight as strategists, we have to fight the culture of immediacy, which I get because everyone is getting advice from everybody on every platform. They just want the noise to go away and they want it to be simple. I think you can get both. I think you can have tactical guidance, but I agree with you. You got to do the work.
Yeah,
Uh,
not
it's
easy, right?
yeah,
Well, so I often say that I am in the assumption busting business because assumptions, right? And the nearly 200 cognitive biases that affect our thinking and decision making get in the way of future readiness and growth, right? Assumptions keep companies stuck in the past,
yeah,
clinging to old ideas and models. And you've said that products and services and brand experiences are often viewed as non-negotiable, and you advocate for pioneering over following with strategies that seek to redefine categories and expectations, not just refine them.
Right.
And I really love how this challenges sort of the safe and incremental changes that most companies make. And so I'm curious, how do you approach challenging the non-negotiables when they're deeply embedded in a brand or their identity? And maybe what are some steps that leaders can take to sort of break this non-negotiable mindset?
No, yeah, I think we could start with the 2-year-old test. Why? Why is it this way, right? As a parent, and even as just friends who are inquisitive, it doesn't even
The
have to
five
involve
whys
kids.
from Honda, right?
Yeah, just I think, why are they that way? Why are there certain assumptions? Now, certain industries, they're there because, again, as we were saying earlier, risk. But it starts with that. And then I think for teams, it's really about giving them the safe space to fail, because there's a lot of cultural things within teams, especially right now at agencies where they're all under the gun to deliver on what they need. Clients have budget cuts. It's hard. You and I were talking earlier about just getting an open brain space to do the work. And I think particularly for strategists who oftentimes are brought in and expected to kind of be like, here's the strategy person or the futurist. They're going to say a smart thing and you're going to love it. And then we're going to go do it. You need to put in the time and the work, but you need the safe space, the psychological safety in certain team cultures to break things and not have to ask for permission. And that is a bit of a trope. You hear it out there a lot, but executing that in teams and in their cultures, especially where you come in and maybe the organization isn't performing as well as it needs to, and you feel like you don't have license to do that way. But I always like to start there, like, why are these non-negotiables here? Is it a policy reason? Is it a financial reason? And then not necessarily stop there, but push a little bit. And if you can, again, this comes down to empathy and culture with the audience. If they seem silly, try to say it. Be like, really? Is that really a thing? And you may learn from a client or a team that it is. We don't challenge it because of political reasons in the company. The more you can get down to the brass tacks of why something is there, whether it's been challenged, will equip you, to my earlier point about helping that person be a change agent. Maybe it's just not understood. Maybe if it has a financial risk associated with it, well, then we know the work we have to do is build a case that allows that thing to move in a different, or to challenge the assumption, to make it negotiable. But to your earlier point, a mindset that says, we're going to make it negotiable, but we're going to have to also make a case on why it should be negotiable versus just avoiding it. Is generally what I've tried to do with teams. And, it doesn't always work. Some things culturally are set and you have to kind of work with it. I had a contractor once work on our basement in our home. We have an old home that's about 80 years old, and the basement was leaking. And I never thought this would tie into a strategy conversation in futures, but
here we go.
The contractor came in and the basement was leaking, and I was just going to patch the wall. And the contractor said this very Zen statement. He's like, we don't work against the water. We work with it. We usher the water to the lowest place. And I sat there thinking of my 8th grade science class being like, the water is going to do its thing.
Right.
In many ways, that's the same with the non-negotiables and being bold. Is we're going to work with them. We're going to have to push, but you're going to have to let the water is going to find the lowest place. And the client's culture or the organization's culture is going to find that, including your own team. You may inherit a team that you're going to have to work with water a little bit. As long as to your first question, the places of uncertainty that they're comfortable with, that the expectation is, we want you to think of things to be done when no one else has defined them yet. If that's there, then the water hopefully will flow in the right direction.
The water will flow. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think non-negotiables often seem like they're set in stone, but water around the stone, if we try to
we're gonna
take the metaphor a little further, but they're actually self-imposed limitations based on outdated assumptions or past successes, or they're just simply relics of a different time. And again, this is a bugaboo of mine. It's like, this is where the laziness and the complacency gets in the way of like asking these deeper questions, and people aren't identifying their sacred cows, right? And, they're just, everybody's walking around, well, that's all untouchable. Well, guess what? it might not be.
Yeah, says who, if it's a
Right.
lot of, yeah. And I think it's less prone in digitally native, like organizations that were inherently built from a culture of experimentation, of trying and failing. We read about that all the time. There's a litany of books on it. It's the bigger companies, the big blue chip folks, where there may be pockets of that. But right now it's hard. A lot of folks, there's been a lot of challenges. There's been layoffs and things. People aren't like, they probably think it. And and that's to my point. If you can get the real talk out of them, great. They
Yeah.
think it, but doing it is a whole nother beast.
Yeah.
And yeah, every now and then you might get a maverick player who just is ready to challenge it. But more often than not, it takes the work. Like you said earlier, you can't just do a quick checklist of change.
Yeah, although I'm going to provocate on that because I work with a lot of startups now. I'm not talking about agencies in this context, and I feel like those guys and gals are super, they're just focused on the next year. They're not willing to like step outside their comfort zone, which as someone who has worked in startups and been a leader in startups, I've started my own companies. I have empathy for that position. But listen, if your head's down for a year and you don't look around or see around corners, guess what? You may have just wasted right?
Yeah.
Because of how fast innovation and the market moves, right?
Yeah.
And you talked about tools that you use, and some of my favorite ones are like, asking questions like, what if you killed the thing that made you famous,
Yeah.
right? Like if you're a brand, because like proposing the death of something that is central to that company or brand, then you start to create the space for what, so that people can imagine what could emerge from those ashes, right? And it forces
Yeah.
you at the same time to confront some of the hard truths that actually could be the biggest threat to future growth of the
Yeah.
actual company.
Yeah. I love that exercise. A similar one of like, if we went away tomorrow, who would really miss us? Some of these simple little, like the one I mentioned earlier, if we took the opposite of what we were saying, you
Mm-hmm.
always see our strategy is to be the leading customer service centric, blah, blah, blah. Cool. The opposite of that would be we're going to be the worst non-customer centric. Like, who would say that,
Right.
So, yeah, I think trying to poke and prod to get folks to feel comfortable in challenging the status quo. And look,
Mm-hmm.
to your point, there it may have to be broken down. Like any good strategy, we have to chunk it out a little bit. It may just be a dedicated discussion around their culture. And particularly in startups where, like you said, everything, every little move, every dollar has to be accounted for. Not that big companies don't have that too,
Mm-hmm.
but I said this earlier, it's a little one, a lot of my teams know there's a price of being wrong is varies. And for some folks, that's very high. But you got to know that first. Like, let's get that stuff out first before we start trying some frameworks and tools to shift our mindset.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
sure.
And to your point of starting small, like another thing I love is doing a little sacrificial lamb experiment where you
Yeah.
isolate one non-negotiable, challenge it, run a pilot around it, because then it lets your team test bold ideas in more of a controlled environment, while, to your point earlier, giving them the confidence to go further once they realize, oh, the sky has not fallen, right?
Right. Well, exactly, Regan. And I think, I mentioned earlier this kind of proliferation of piloting that's going on now. And you're starting to see, I don't think we're any close to like, there's the hype cycle around AI and generative AI, et cetera. And one of the interesting things I'll see with teams is everybody's pilot seems like a nice, easy start. It's like kind of a crawl, walk, run. It's not super committal, but there's a thing going on. So we can say we've done something. But one of
Mm-hmm.
the issues often is, do you know what you're looking for and measuring? And that's the age old scientific method. We have a hypothesis, we have a
Mm-hmm.
set of use cases. And this is where, that kind of vibe cultural check for strategy teams and futurists, if you say too much of those words, your eyes will glaze over and they'll be, okay, Professor so and so, we don't need, are we doing a biology experiment? Maybe. We want to know. We think we have an answer to something and we have a clear way of measuring it. Because I have seen a bit of that. Everybody being told you got to pilot, you got to try it. Yes. But make sure you know what you're measuring for. And to your point about getting a little momentum and doing it small, that you know how you're going to talk about an outcome. If it seems risky, then maybe that's your provocation, that you're intentional about the pilot, that says, if it goes south, if our hypothesis fails, let's have that conversation too, versus just shut it down because it didn't do the thing we thought it would. That's something for teams to be comfortable with. That's vital. Otherwise, you're just in like perpetual pilots.
Yeah. Well, what I'm taking away from this part of our discussion around challenging non-negotiables, it's about, a combination of a cultural shift, strategic experimentation, and then, a reevaluation of what is being held or interpreted as truly core to a company. Like really kind of approaching it that way is a simple framework that people can use.
Yeah. And then having, that's exactly right, Regan, is those steps. And I'd add one little other element is empathy. Have some empathy for the audience, because that's going to only increase the credibility of the steps and the tactics we've discussed. If you can spend a little time putting yourself in the shoes of that audience and all of the things that they are likely dealing with, it'll help in having richer conversations and the efficacy of those steps you just mentioned. And there's a range of, empathy. Sometimes it's tricky, right? Because people aren't going to be that open in business contexts, that they're going to think you're trying to sell them something. So it comes down to the classic methods of a good strategist or team leader of have some good questions, the ones we talked about. What if we went away tomorrow? And what would happen if you broke this rule? And frame those from a point of empathy. Like, we know you might be in trouble with your boss, but talk to me about that,
unearthing those emotions and
a
lot of what we're talking about. That's why I always tell people, like, my work starts in the mind.
Yes.
Before we even begin a client engagement, we need to start with the mind. I actually have a series, like I use it assumptions and bias canvas, and like we got to get all the stuff that's in here.
I completely agree, Regan. And it's easy to discuss as the two of us are here talking about what we've seen. I think as a leader with teams, it's also something that you have to constantly prioritize. You have to constantly remind yourself. For folks like us, where we've seen a lot of different things, worked across sectors, but we have a lot of folks where there's anxiety, there's imposter syndrome. And no one wants to, we've all felt it. I still feel it today. It's really connecting as a leader. If you're in charge of a team today and you're hearing what we're talking about and you're saying, well, what's my first step? It's just listening. Just really looking for those cues, looking for verbal and nonverbal cues from your team about where they may be reluctant to pursue in any of these methods we've talked about. That's truly something that I think folks skip over. They want to get right into the testing, learning, and pushing. But the human element within the team is just absolutely, I couldn't emphasize it enough. And I've learned a lot, pros and cons in that. It's giving people.
And it's interesting you talk about imposter syndrome, and what's coming up for me is humility, vulnerability. Like I had a meeting with a client yesterday, and I said, hey, how do you think this thing went? Because actually I've never done it before. And so I was just being very humble and transparent and vulnerable, and they were like, oh my God, we had no idea. Like, and I was like, maybe my type A overachiever brain that I keep trying to rewire, like kind of coming into play. But it's also, there were younger folks in this meeting, and I could tell that they appreciated the opportunity to kind of start to have, even though I'm not, even an FTE, it was like, oh, here's this person who's, working with us on a project, and she's like, hey, like, I've never done this before. And like, so I want your feedback on what could have gone better and what went well. It was really the context of the conversation.
100%, Regan. And I think, you see some of this, it's interesting because, in the role I'm playing now, that blend, there's always been the camp of strategists and then folks leading work in businesses, maybe they're account people or client partners, what have you. And there's this like old tension of like, well, we do the thinking work and call us in, and then we'll like shake hands and be friends with the client. And nothing could be further from my mind of what success comes from, because you were talking about that idea of being vulnerable. There's a decent amount of behavioral economics research showing that when you show a bit of skepticism, well, I'm not sure I can help you with this, versus I've got the answer, which I think you oftentimes see in teams, either the team to their manager saying, oh, boss, I've got it. I've got, somebody's trying to be a hero, right? Oh, I know it. I've got that killer insight and it's amazing. And there's been a culture of that, particularly in agencies over the years. I think what you point out is spot on, of a little bit of hesitancy, a little of like, hey, I think I have an idea of where we want to go. I'm not 100% sure though, and I want to work through that with you. In my career and with some of my teams, that I've seen yield more success than we have the answer. We have a case study or a method that we're bringing in. Sometimes that's needed because the client has been through so many rounds of useless, boring strategy that they need somebody to just come in with some confidence.
Yeah.
But more often than not, it's exactly as you said. It's a little bit of skepticism, even though your team, you might be like, I totally know what's needed here. Approaching it from, hey, I think maybe, I'm not sure if this is going to work for you, but let's work through it, can earn you way more equity, 2-3 meetings later.
I love that. I always say future readiness starts with asking bold questions that don't just make us feel good, but make us think hard. Because I think a lot of people ask questions that just make them feel good, right?
Yes. Yes. Like, particularly strategists. Like, I've said this to several of my colleagues and teams in recent years, is there has been a hero culture where oftentimes strategists, futurists, those that are charged with knowing what to do when others don't and dealing with uncertainty, there's a pressure there that you're going to come in and have a magic framework or a couple killer questions, and many do, but there's also the reality that we may not. And the best strategists play curious. They're just like, I'm not going to pretend I have the answer yet.
Yeah.
But when we get closer, I'm going to be hopefully somebody that reduces the anxiety a bit and gets us in a direction that we will at least get us to the choices we need to make.
Yeah. Well, it's about, you've said this earlier, it's about not like true readiness is knowing that you don't have all the answers, but having the courage to ask the questions, having the resilience to navigate the journey, as this journey, because it is a journey that unfolds, and coming at it from a perspective of humility, vulnerability, empathy, I think it's funny. It's like, sometimes I feel like I'm throwing out a lot of buzzwords, but these are important words and they're nuanced. Each one means something different.
You're right. And they're buzzwords because people recognize they're being mentioned a lot, because it's like some stereotypes. There's a kernel of truth somewhere in some, not all, obviously. Yeah. And I think normalizing that a bit, being open, because there's an overconfidence at times because strategists are often asked to defend their work, or folks that are maybe in client partner roles. There's a lot of pressure because you're being held accountable for outcomes, but you may not always feel equipped to drive and move that water towards the outcome. So the buzzwords are there because everybody's talking about it, but doesn't necessarily know that folks know how to apply them. And my hope is with, what you're doing and learning and normalizing this sense of safety, of imposter syndrome, normalizing that will actually help us all collectively do more bold things.
Yeah, move the needle a bit. So, well, risk-taking has come up a bit in our conversation. And so I'd love to, and, the other side of that coin is experimentation, right? Now, another quote I love saying by Thomas Edison. So he once remarked, this is one of my favorite quotes ever: I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. And I just love that. I mean, this really speaks to me because it really reframes the concept of failure. And coming from a man who revolutionized industries and saw things that others didn't, I think that is something we're chewing on. I chew on that quote a lot.
Oh, yeah. Right? No, I think,
Innovation, it is not a straight line. It's messy, it's iterative, but we live in a world, unfortunately, hopefully maybe we can change this. This is the hill I'm going to die on, but in a world that rewards instant results, his mindset, what he says really challenge us to embrace persistence, curiosity, knowing that sort of each step, or each experiment is a step towards progress and future readiness. And I know you've talked a lot about having cultures and building cultures of experimentation. And so how do you inspire your team to embrace some of this unconventional thinking that could actually completely alter either your company's future or your client's future? Because again, that fear component comes in again. And what steps or what advice would you offer for leaders who want to embed more of this risk-taking and play into their companies?
Yeah, no, great question, Regan. I couldn't agree more. I was actually at my son's back to school night last week, and there was a picture in one of the classrooms of Abraham Lincoln. and I never knew this. It cited, I don't have them all off of memory, all of his failures until he became president. Like the number of times he didn't, same
Yeah.
sort of thing. And I think there's a quote around, if the wind isn't there, go to the oars. It's like an old Latin thing I saw the other day. But to your question, how do we get a culture of experimentation going? And I'll say a caveat here, because I'm sure if I ask my creative colleagues who I've admired over the years, they may have seen me more as a more reserved strategist. I don't know. The measure of experimentation varies, but I think a few things. One, if you're leading a team and you don't find the experimentation is there, probe a bit on the side hustles. One of the things that the teams I've worked on where experimentation was much more common is most of the constitution of that team had folks who did weird, funky stuff. They had side hustles, hobbies, and to the point earlier, embrace that, let people feel safe talking about their fascination with water in basements. I don't know, if you could, and if that's not there, then consider ways that you can be a little more horizontal with the team. Are there things the entire team can go do together, class? But I think the most creative people I've ever worked with who are prone to more experimentation have had a wide range of life experiences, which goes to the point of having a diverse team. So if you're a leader now saying, I want more experimentation on my team, take a look at the team. Does the team look like America, or does the team look all like you? Little things like that, which I know are on the minds of lots of leaders, but it's, in my experience, the more you can get the different lived experiences in the group, the more you're going to get challenging of things and questions, which generally lead to, we should try that or not. So that would be point one, is really looking at the constitution of the team and their lived experiences, the funky, interesting things they do, and foster a bit of that out. The second would be what we talked about earlier, is letting them know failure is okay. And that usually starts with yourself as the leader, is straight up saying, and I've learned over the years, like some of my teams, I'll share all kinds of weird stories of things I've had happen in my life. And maybe some of my teams have been like, John's a little TMI. But that, again, I'm doing that. I'm doing that intentionally, because if I talk about weird stuff, my weird smells of my teenage boys or the dog doing, then somebody in that group is going to be like, if this person is saying this, then I'm going to bring up something. That's my hope, right? So it's normalizing failure. So it's diversity and makeup of the team and interesting experiences and really learning that of the team, then also collectively embracing, you're starting with yourself, because you'll get a lot of leaders who are like, oh, it's fine to fail. And then the next thing you know, they have a performance review and like, you failed on this and this and this. Right. And so you kind of have to lead by doing in many ways. And then the third is probably around the tools to experiment. Some of those are very tactical, whether they're research tools and methods, frameworks, strategy frameworks that help you deal with uncertainty. There's a lot of futurists, there's a lot of, new horizons. And sometimes folks want to experiment, but they don't have the scaffolding to do it. And so a good leader can go out, and these are free things. You can go out, you can look at innovation methods. There's a whole lot out on the internet. Design thinking, I know that's been around now for a while, but it's the roots of that still are about empathetic, productive thinking, looking at the world around you. So it's looking at the constitution of the team and embracing side hustles, weird things, and the full color of the people on the team and all of their lived experiences. It's failing yourself and normalizing that. And the third is looking at some of the tools and ways to think about it so that folks feel like they can take an action. And I haven't been perfect in those areas, certainly over the years as leader. I've fallen down in spots. But generally, when those conditions are there, you start to get some of the provocations, the boldness, the confidence that we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Well, and guess what? You talked about falling down. I talk a lot in my work about health. I make, metaphors around exercise. That's why my show is called Future Fit. This is a fitness.
Yeah.
And it's like, but once you start to build these muscles, when you fall down, guess what? You're going to get up much quicker. Right. Versus if it's, just like if you haven't worked out in a really long time. Same goes for a lot of these capacities and capabilities that we've been talking about. And I love, the idea of normalizing failure, because teams that are not afraid to fail together are more likely to collaborate effectively, share knowledge, and support each other and taking those bold steps. And so when a failure is normalize, trust with teams improves because people feel safe to express ideas and take initiative without fear of judgment. So, for example, I thought this was really interesting. So Eli Lilly, the pharmaceutical company, they actually have failure parties as a way to show appreciation for pioneering teams that failed intelligently.
I love that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like of all the places of something like that to come from, right?
Yeah.
And so not only did these parties show appreciation and helped the scientists cope with their disappointment, but they also ensured that others in the company learned about the failure to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah.
Right? And
I love that.
Yeah,
I'm writing that down as a reference because I know you're
go ahead.
I love that. Yeah, just normalize. And again, to the earlier points around, for a company like Eli Lilly, I actually worked with them a few years ago, and their mission of what they're trying to do in life sciences and pharmaceuticals. Yeah, that I love the boldness of being like, we have to fail. Like it won't move forward unless we learn from our failures. Totally fits that. I can see that line of sight in their culture. But then you think of like a company that maybe works in refrigeration or something, right? Or cookware or what have you. Finding the relevant link to the business of that type of tactic becomes another job to be done for the leader that wants to that's pharmaceuticals, life sciences, discovery science, et cetera. Let me think about my space, going back to, preparing and reflecting on the empathy of the client I'm dealing with. Where is failure necessary to advance their objectives? And how do I normalize it in an interesting way, whether it's throwing a party or bringing some ideas of related industries and sectors, something to normalize it. I love that. I love that idea that they've done. It fits right in to what I would hope our life sciences companies are doing.
Yeah, and beyond. So now, is there anything else you'd like to add before I bring our conversation to a close, Jon?
No, this has been great, Regan. And I guess just to thank you for broaching these topics, for doing this effort and bringing leaders of all different stripes into this. It's something that I think is needed now more than ever. So I want to thank you for doing what you do and raising these kinds of interesting topics and provocations. It's hopeful. As a teacher, I hope this helps way more people than we know.
Yeah, I love it. So a final question before you share where our listeners can find you. In your view, is preparing for the future more about managing risks or capitalizing on opportunities?
Ooh. I would have to say capitalizing opportunities, because everything we just talked about, Regan, if I said it was all about managing risks, that's a mindset. It's not false. It's necessary.
Right.
My concern would be we'd be putting ourselves in the wrong mindset versus opportunity that also has risk is a better positive framing that I would want to think about the future and the pace of, the quote, opportunity often shows up dressed in overalls. It takes work.
I love that one.
You know what I mean? And I think I've used way too many quotes today, but
me too. No,
that would be my answer there.
I love it.
Is probably how that would be my mental model for that one.
I love that. And with that, Jon, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Sure. So, follow on LinkedIn is probably the best spot where I often will share work my team is doing or that I'm working on. You can also follow me on X at Jon Judah, are two spots that are probably the easiest for folks to follow, or just reach out on email, jonjudah@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and your brilliant insights, Jon. It has been enlightening, and I've had so much fun exploring with you today.
Same.
We'll have to do a part 2.
Yes. Or throw a failure party if no one likes anything that we have.
Yes. Hey, listen, I'm down. I am so down.
I don't think that's going to be the case, but yeah, it's been a joy, Regan, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Future Fit. If you're listening, you're probably future curious. So follow me in my newsletter on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going and share your discoveries with the Future Fit community. And if you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe, rate, and review Future Fit on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time.